Welcome back to my studio. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be breaking down a full organic house track, and it's not just a hypothetical organic house style track. This is actually a release that I have that, if you're watching this, I guess it's probably just come out. It's called Magnolia. It's out on Elysion under my name, Ryan Diefenbach. I'd really appreciate if you show it some support on Beatport, Spotify, or your streaming platform of choice. We're going to use this to extract some insights like developing an organic drum groove, creating your own sample-based instruments to use, writing melodic call and response elements, building out your starting loop into a full arrangement, and of course a basic introduction to a final mixdown. Let's get into it. This is obviously unmastered, but let's play a bit of the breakdown. So if I want to get a good overview of my project, then what I can do is hold Option and click on one of these little horizontal line icons, and that's going to pull everything down and we get an overview of the project. So I don't want to flex, but I think I'm relatively organized. I think there are a few things here that could be better, but that's something that I want to address before we get into specifics. And that is to have everything structured. So have your drums in a drum folder, your bass, you can of course put them together if you have a bus preference, but if I'm working on this like a year later, or I want to add something, or I'm looking for something that I want to eliminate that's bothering me, that is going to be really difficult if nothing is labeled. It's all like this one layer, for example, 38 Gusang, it's this string element. So I could of course be better, but with that exception, I would generally know that I have this Asian strings, that if I have a percussion element, it would be in percussion, and you'd be shocked how many people who are producing at like quite a high level who are shooting themselves in the foot, that they're losing a lot of time when they could be focusing on creative development and working out and testing different ideas. So I can't stress this enough. Be structured. I want to have a separate video on this, and if I have it out, I'll link it in the description, but let's keep going. The bottom here, I have a folder called refs, and these are a couple of references. A lot of people as beginners are really skeptical to the idea of using references because you feel like, oh, I want to be really creative and original and I don't want to borrow ideas from other people. But if we don't have a starting point, especially in the beginner and intermediate stages, then it's really difficult to work out a lot of things like arrangement and mixing and sound design. So we'll come back to these a bit later. But it's always a good practice to think about references when you're starting in the track, in the middle of the track, or also in the mixdown. I like to have 3 for different purposes, but we'll come to those later. So as promised, the first thing we are going to cover is the drum groove. So if we're creating an organic drum groove, of course, we want to start typically with the kick. And I just have a single kick. Nothing fancy, I've just kept it fairly short and not too intense, because often the kick is the hero of the track, as it is here, but I really wanted the bass to shine as well. So if we jump straight from the kick into this folder I've called the lows, I have 2 separate bass elements. Let's pick a section where they're both playing and turn that on. So the first one is just a simple sub element. So if we go all the way to the start of the song, I put like a little EQ so that the kick sounds a bit underwater just for the start. So maybe that's not the best point. Let's skip a little bit ahead. Yeah, there I'll have turned it off in the arrangement. We can come to that later. But hopefully if you have good headphones or some speakers, you're able to hear it, because that sub information is just really low. I talk about this in another video, but a lot of the time you want to separate your sub and your other bass element here. So I've got a sub that is just that low sine wave information. If we have a look, I'm just using the Ableton basic sub sine with a bit of distortion. I've EQ'd it like really hard, carved it out, and then that is giving space for this second bass element. So when that comes in, it's got a lot of variation over the track. Starts out a bit subtle and growly. And what I'm using is this Arturia Mini plugin, but you could use like Wavetable or really like Diva, anything of choice. And they complement each other really well. I think that's the test of a track. I've got a few different patterns. They're mostly imitating each other just in those different frequencies. But if you look at that, the first thing we've done as well is we try not to have bass notes hitting on the 1, 2, 3, 4 where the kick is landing. So that's one of the first ways to get a better groove. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's often a really good place to start if you're wanting to develop a very groovy sound. And maybe you're not at an advanced level where it's like super intuitive, but that can be the first step, just trying to have not too many things happening at the same time, and that will give you a sense of groove. Something you can also do is dive into the groove pool. So if we pull open this sidebar, you have this groove section, and also you can turn on and off the groove pool here. We can drag in a few different things and then put them in our clips. So I've got a couple that I've introduced here. And I'm basically applying a version of that to the bass and then using that in some other elements. And that's the nice thing about the pool, is that I can adjust it. I can drag it down in here. Like I've already got it, but now I've got a duplicate. As you can see, I've duplicated a few of them. And I can say, oh, how much do I want to quantize to exactly be on time? How much do I want to apply of the timing of the actual groove itself to follow that groove timing? And you also have randomness and velocity as well if there's big velocity variation. So that can help something sound not too static. So already we have a little bit of interest just from a kick and a sub, and that then complements well when we bring in that other bass element. But we don't want to spend too much time on that high bass because I feel like it's almost cheating. It has so much character that we're kind of getting distracted from where else we can get groove. So let's jump into the rest of the drums. So we have what I've called soft claps, which is almost like a rim. There's a couple of different sounds there. So that's obviously happening on the 2 and the 4 between the kicks. And later I have some hard claps come in as well. These are more like intense character 909 style claps. And what I have as well is a few different hats. So I've got these gentle open hats. And that's really gentle, almost like a shaker. I've got some closed hats that sometimes happen together with the other one, sometimes on their own. And you hear like that's pretty intense. It's almost like a bell. So that's 2 elements that I've laid together. So if we just take this like original hi-hat, that's just like the transient. and then this cymbal is like the bell of the cymbal, you're hitting a drum. But it just kind of doesn't work one without the other. So it's got a bit more of an interesting sound. I've EQ'd it, and then what's important for groove that you can do on your drums or your percussion elements is add a bit of side chaining. So with and without, it's like immediately a bit more annoying, like it's just happening the whole time. And as you start to add more and more things, it becomes increasingly important that there's like not too much happening at the same time. And that doesn't mean like, oh, we just sidechain everything to each other, but you're able to really like accentuate those grooves that you have in these clips. So you can put the groove in here, but in addition to that, you can say, okay, I turn on that compressor. And then, yeah, you can make it way more extreme. You can have it kind of pumping, and then that's mapped to the ghost kick. You can map it to your kick as well, like that's a whole other topic, but basically you can create something that's a bit shorter that will give you more shaping opportunities. One of the most important things of filling out the groove, when we're thinking about groove, it's not just like hats and claps and percussions. Toms are really important. So you have that kick and the bass, and having another element like a tom can really like fill it out and give it a bit more movement. So I've made a simple drum rack with a few toms from different places, and I've just experimented with them. So if we only take like the kick and the bass, and what's important with these toms here is that I've made them quite short, because you have really elongated bass notes that are happening, you have the kicks, and you have lots of other things that are coming in the percussion. So I've actually even like gone in on some in the tom rack and like shortened them where I feel like they might clash. Moving into percussion, probably one of the most important things for me in Organic House. I feel like it's basically the life of the entire track. This is where we're getting that like really organic feeling. So just the kick and the percussion groups alone, without the kind of main drums, you already have so much life and groove in there itself. So what we're going to do is going to break down those sub layers. We have quite a few. So let's start with this African drum plugin, which is West African drums from Native Instruments. And it's got a few bits and pieces, but so this is basically like a really high-end drum rack that also has some other capabilities, but I've just drawn in some like bongos and toms and other percussive elements in a single MIDI file, and I think that works really well with the toms that we have from the drums. So if I put that together with the toms, they're kind of playing off each other again, like not too much happening at exactly the same time. I don't want to like copy paste and repeat the same pattern. That's how we get groove. So just like shifting things over, trying to go in the empty spaces and fill it up, and then also scale it back when we've like filled it up, but we feel like there's not enough breathing room. In addition to that, we have the shaker group. So since we have like the kick and the bass and the tom really building out a groove in that low end, we can create a groove in the high end. So that's able to happen more at the same time without conflicting in different spaces in the frequency spectrum. So let's break them down one by one. I've got quite a few. So the first shaker loop, is like really high. So really, really high frequency. And then the next one is a bit lower. Still got some high energy, but you see we've like bumped it a little bit before and opened up the EQ a bit more. And then if we go to the third one, let's just isolate that. I've really compressed it. So I've got this glue compressor going. That's, if I turn that off, there's these big notes happening. And I wanted a bit more pumpy action because in combination with all the other shakers, I didn't want that like jumping out too much. That's often what compression is used for, just kind of like taming peaks in its most basic form. And I've added a bit of body with a tool called Erosion, and you'll see it's moving there slowly, and that's basically distortion that is automated from this LFO. And that's just to give it a bit more variation. Like I don't want to have a bunch of shaker loops that are all repetitive because that will make like the groove feel repetitive and it will become boring over time. It's something that I say a lot, but I really believe in it. And then there's just some slight automation in the arrangement as well with like an auto filter. I have another shaker loop, which I guess I can see that I've decided not to use. So that's even lower, which makes sense in terms of the logic that you have like a high, a really high, and then maybe a slightly lower shaker. But I guess in terms of the arrangement, I just found that it wasn't working with the whole thing. So don't be afraid to deactivate layers if you find in the context of the full track, this is actually creating some clash and this is a bit too much. I have this Afro jazz percussion kit as well, which I'm basically using as kind of like gentle drum brushes. If I go into the clip as well, you can see there's a fair bit of velocity automation. So when it's higher, you're getting more energy and you're able to kind of manually shape the groove like that. So you hear it's like on the off beats, which is when a lot of the shakers and things are coming in. And then you're like generating and following that groove a little bit. So let's play. And then we have a clave as well, which is just like a little wooden block. And this is almost like Afro House inspired, the rhythm that we have as well. It's like very much in line with the snares, but not following exactly the snares. So that's how we're creating the groove. That it's a bit of a paradox, like a bit of unity in that feeling and pattern, but also a bit of variation that things are weaving in and out and doing their own thing. So it's just like a small element, but I think it's really important to the groove. That's why claves and wood blocks and things are so popular in organic house. And for creating grooves, it's very important to experiment, and this is not a checklist that you apply to every layer. There's a bunch of different tools that you can have in your toolkit, and then you go to each layer, your snare, your clave, your shakers, and you see even within the shakers, they're not all necessarily quantized exactly. They're not all applied to the same groove. They don't all have automated LFOs. They don't all have velocity automation and things like that. But those are things that will work for some loops and will not work for others. So maybe just like go through those individually until you feel the whole thing together starting to gel in that groove. When I was writing Magnolia, I had a really clear idea in my head that I had heard different East Asian string instruments and I wanted to try using those in a dance track. So I looked at various sample libraries and plugins and things, but I was just in the studio. I wanted there and then to try it, and I want to show you how you can get started if you have an idea of how to experiment with the sound. But you don't want to download a 20 gig, $200 sample library. So this is the sound that we ended up with. And how I got that was basically just taking a single sound file, I think it was in Splice, and I was searching different Chinese string instruments, and I found a couple of different notes, and I took just one particular note, and it was that simple. You can use sampler or simpler. So if I open up a new MIDI track and I go simpler, let's just drop sample here. Let's say so here we have two notes, for example, that when I let it release, I think I actually did use this sample somewhere else in the song, but all you have to do is drag that. There are different ways to do it, but if you just drag it. If you don't want that bend, you can make it even shorter. And you can even add the bend in yourself. So if you want to get like a little bit more feeling, it's honestly that simple, and it usually sounds a lot better than you think with some basic effects. I've just got like a bit of plate reverb and some delay. That's like the stock delay send in Ableton. And I was really worried about this, that you feel like, oh, like people going out and recording everything from scratch. And like, of course, that's super fun. I advocate for that because, oh, it needs to be really legit. Or if I get a sample library, that's really expensive. It's going to be way better when it's pitched in different frequencies. But I thought the same, and I thought, oh, I'm going to have to replace it later with some kind of like proper Chinese string library. And honestly, it's totally fine. I think if anything is an obstacle to you just getting in a creative flow, like try to push it out of the way. Like if you really want to, you can replace it later, but just start making your own mini instruments and drum racks. It's something like I always advocate for, and just pull something from Splice. If you get a free trial or a subscription, it's usually pretty affordable, and then you get a bunch of credits and you can pull stuff and make your own instruments and experiment there. I'm going to talk a little bit about like call and response and melodic interplay. So I didn't want that happening the whole time in the song, but I needed a little bit more interesting lead information. So I kind of identified the three main elements that I wanted to have as leads. So one was the strings, a second one is the guitar. So I played that in at the studio in the same session. I was just experimenting. And then we also, in this little artifacts, I have a diva synth that sometimes is just playing those artifacts as the name suggests, and then other times is playing longer phrases. And so the important part of kind of writing these melodies is a bit like the groove. They have to really work together. You can't write them individually, slap them on top of each other, and then just expect that everything is going to work and your mix is going to be really clear and that you're going to have an idea. So if you want that idea to shine through, what you want to do is call and response. So a really basic way of showing this is just soloing those three things, the guitar, the Asian strings, and the lead, and just seeing that some sections where you play, they're intentionally spread out so that one thing is kind of talking at a time, a bit like a conversation. So if I play, It's almost like the string is waiting for the guitar to finish. So it says something, guitar starts saying something back, and it's waiting till the guitar's about to finish, and then the string comes back in. And we really work with that in a few other sections. It's not that all three have to be talking. So we can have the guitar and the little lead bit. So we're just like kind of creating a subliminal dialogue that is happening, and this is like nothing innovative. It's super common in basically all types of music. It's just that typically you don't necessarily know that it's happening, or that it's also happening in electronic music. So try to create phrases in that way, and you can literally just like write a longer phrase and then chop it up in the MIDI clips or in the audio clips and shuffle them around so that they're not happening at the same time. And then you might find a kind of conversation that works for your song. Okay, we've had a look at quite a few elements already, but I think there's a few more things in the synth and keys elements, and also the effects bus that I'm going to show. And then we're going to talk about the full arrangement in context, how you go from just a small idea and turn it into a total track. So in addition to that little ARP element, we also have some pads that are kind of like steel pan sound. They're taken from Diva. So I have a piano as well. Called it granular piano because I have this EFX fragments element. I sent it to a friend. I think it was this track, or maybe it was another one, and someone said like, oh, it's good, but the piano is like a bit dull or boring. So I probably overthought that, and I added some RC20 to add a little bit of like lo-fi character, and then some shimmery granular elements with this EFX on the top. Have a few more of these like Asian string elements. It's like a tremolo, and then have this like impact note, which is like really short and got lots of delay, mostly used in transitions, but I think it adds to the overall track. And then let's just listen to the whole effects bus at a particular point in time where there's a lot of it going on. So let's say here. So it's like really atmospheric. I call it effects, but it could be anything, you know, atmosphere, texture. The voices are from an Arturia plugin called Augmented Voices, which is really cool. But you can also just use like samples, the same as with the Chinese instrument. You can chop things up yourself, either in a drum rack or in Simpler or a sampler. I have some Atmos birds as well, just to add little like chirpy notes. You almost can't hear it, but in the big picture, I think it adds up. And then we have like a few transitions. So some of them are audio effects and some of them are made in Diva, like white noise generation. So we'll just listen to them together. And a Chinese cymbal as well, with a lot of delay or echo. So now that we have all of the pieces, I'm going to show you how I typically put them together. So like I said, when you zoom out on the work file, you see that everything is fairly organized in terms of the layers in a vertical axis in this view, but also horizontally, it's really structured in phrases. So you have all of these markers. If you just right click in the timeline, you can say add locator, and you can make useful notes for yourself. So I would start to build out things in terms of phrases, and those phrases are usually phrases of like 8, 16, 32 if you want to break it down to total basics. So a whole chorus, if you will, or a breakdown or a bridge or a verse will often be like around 32 bars. So I would build something like that to start with that has almost all of my elements. So if I play this drop section, you can see visually like it's probably the busiest. There's the most layers happening. So what I would probably do, I'd recommend working on one section, your loop, where people get stuck, but really digging it out like with all the layers and making sure you really like it. There's a few turnarounds. We've talked about the groove, the call and response and everything, and making sure that's fleshed out and just like make it as full as possible. You can scale it back a bit and you can strip elements, but once we have that, then we can already say, okay, let's take this entire section and we can just literally copy paste it to an earlier chorus. So that's almost identical and we're able to like build it out in that sense. So now that we have those two sections, we might say like what's between those or what's before that. And that's why those markers are really important to say, oh, we want to have like a breakdown. And then eventually made that into two parts. And I obviously want to have an introduction and a build-up before that chorus, and I want to have an outro. And once you have the main segment in terms of like your break, your drop, it's way easier to develop out from there because you're usually just stripping things away. So if we go into some other sections, it's nice to have variants. And you see like I've color-coded them as well. That although for me bass is blue, I've got a few different patterns that are like very slightly different, and sometimes things are happening together and sometimes not. And that's all I'm doing is like dragging things around in the arrangement and then saying, okay, I want to take this chorus and I want to turn it into a verse. So let's say like, so the sub might more or less be the same. It might be just staying on one note instead of going through the whole chord progression, at least in this particular spot. And we might not have like every single one of our percussion elements happening too. So you see a lot of that with the shakers, that they're like coming in, out, in, out. In the breakdown, they're all going away. So of course, like in our drop, probably all of them or most of them are happening at some point in time, but in these other things, we can just introduce them progressively. Automation is probably its entire own topic within production, mixing, anything really. But in terms of arrangement, I think this Moog bass is a really important example of how we're like kind of creating tension and dynamics over the course of the song. So of course, like we have our big crescendo moment where the bass is going. It's nice and squelchy and open, but we don't necessarily want it to be like that the whole time. So we can also like bring it in slowly and have some variation. You don't need to like draw it in this level of detail, and I've recorded it, which is why it's like kind of come up like this. And you're able to create a lot of tension through that. I think a big part of the arrangement as well is in your drop section, you might have a lot of like leads and synths and things happening, but in a lot of the other verses, not only do you want to create alternative versions of those where it's maybe just a few notes shorter or it's a different melody altogether, but you don't want to play all your cards at once. So if we talk about the main lead synth, the guitar, and the Asian strings, which we talked about being the three most important things. The guitar chords are not actually like coming in until much later, and the guitar lead over the course of the whole track is barely happening at all. So that way we're like able to add real dynamics to the song, and we know that there's a difference between like those verses and breakdowns and the chorus. So really start carving things away, and don't be afraid to like create distinction between those sections, because if everything is high energy, then nothing is high energy, unless it's like 140 BPM rave techno or something that I don't really know anything about. Having like a little bit more dynamics is important if we're talking about organic house, Afro house, all of those things. It doesn't need to be crazy, but you want to add a lot more variation. Yeah, I might be totally psycho with how I like to use these location markers, but I think like just be a bit liberal with them. Like maybe kind of overuse them rather than under, especially when you're getting started. So you have notes to yourself about like, start building up here. Like think about what kind of energy you want to do. It doesn't have to be like add snares, take away lead and things like that. Of course, it's like really useful if you want to be that literal to give yourself little markers. But I think it's more just like what kind of dynamics are you trying to create throughout the larger picture of the song. Although I'm kind of writing notes to myself, me as a producer, these kind of notes are way more useful, that I'm like, okay, I don't want it to be too boring, but I want to maintain that energy. And then you can start to play with taking things out and putting them back in. And of course, you have the amazing shortcut of just like pressing 0 when you're on a clip to deactivate a clip, so that you're not like committed. You'll notice that in a lot of places in my project, like I've just turned things on and off, especially like writing the call and response, writing the arrangement. I just maybe don't want to commit to deleting something entirely, but you can hit 0. That's like a really, really useful arrangement tool, so that you could go around and just like start turning things on or off. And it's no big deal, because you can always bring them back if it feel like it's not quite working. If you're really struggling with the arrangement, references can be a total godsend. So even if it's not in the same BPM of your key, you can pull in a track and just like warp it, like a whole track. You can buy it from Beatport or wherever. And if you hit warp, you'll notice that there's these like natural sections. You can even see them, and they more or less align with our project that I've probably even used this one for like how long should my break be. And you see there, I've got a first section and then a second section of the break, and then you've got your drop, and then your energy goes down. So you don't have to follow these one-to-one, but they like give you a really good idea of like, oh, is my track dragging on too long? How does someone approach creating these transitions between sections? So that's a really, really useful way to go. And then you can base your markers on that and then start to build your track around that. Speaking of references, we're also going to talk very quickly about mixdown. So this track that we're listening to is obviously not mastered in the Ableton project, but you want to have a good mix. It's just like a total principle of organic or Afro house. Of course, you can work with another mixing engineer, but it's like a good practice to have a really good idea of like your hierarchy, of the vision that you have for the song, tonal balance, all of those things. So the basic way to get that is just to work with levels to start with. I think that's the main thing that a lot of people jump straight into, like super crazy compressors, because the first thing I have here is this like API 2500 bus compressor that is really, nice for drums in some cases, and I've used it here. Like a little bit of parallel compression is nice, but the most important thing is going into those individual channels and saying like, okay, do I want the kick a bit louder? Do I want that splashy open hat to be way quieter? So just like go in, and before you do anything else, I'd say spend a lot of time on the levels. And one of the good ways, if you don't naturally know how loud is my kick and my snare and my hat meant to be relative to each other, is also looking at those references. So one of our tracks might be a good reference for the arrangement, but another one might be a really good mix reference that we're like, oh, the chorus is really similar to our chorus or the break. So I can look at my track and compare it to another. I can do that like firstly with my ears, but also look at the waveforms. If there's any big inconsistencies, I like to think there's hopefully not, because these are my references and I've got a finished mix. But one tool that's a bit better than the standard Ableton one is a free plugin called Span. So we can just So you can observe things like how high is your top end with your shakers and other really high elements compared to your kick and your low end, and just try to get them roughly in the same ballpark to start with. So one thing I noticed here, for example, is like, oh, there's a lot of energy in that real top end. Maybe I should tame it, and I don't want to slap an EQ onto the whole thing. You know, a mastering engineer is able to make that final decision, or I can do that in mastering myself. But I really want to work backwards and think, how do I adjust the individual elements to kind of tame that top end? And of course, I know that the shakers have a lot happening in the really high top end. And we've done the obvious thing like we do on most of our tracks, that we cut the low information that is not going to conflict with like the kick and the bass and the tom, so that low end groove can kind of have its own space. But I felt like the shakers and these percussive elements were like still carrying a lot of energy that I didn't want to sacrifice. And I also have all these like lead elements that I didn't want to sacrifice. So one thing that I did was with the arrangement, making not too many things happen together at the same time with the leads. So this was a conscious decision that I had to make, and was like, well, what's going to go? And I said, well, I would rather take that really high information and let it be retained in the shaker group. And if you notice, it's just a really basic EQ in a lot of the other elements, like the guitars, like the guitar lead, in the Asian strings as well, and also in the little arp. There's a massive roll-off at the top. And just by taming those few things, then we're able to let the other things shine, like the Chinese strings, the high-end percussion. And that's just basically the philosophy that we're applying to the entirety of the track. As we already talked about with the groove, there's a bit of side chaining going on. So an obvious one is if you go to your bass, you see that I've got a side chain set to this ghost kick so that it kind of ducks out of the way. And since the bass gets quite long in some sections, I've also got a side chain to the tom, just so like those fundamentals can peek through. Otherwise it starts to get drowned out and disappear in the low end, and it's like really big between the sub and the Moog bass that I don't feel like I'm really sacrificing anything by giving like a little bit of room to the toms in very specific places. The guitar bus has a different UAD compressor. It's the LA2A, but again, I'm not going to go into that because it's more for like adding character and a bit of polish. What's more important, I think, is by reviewing the playing and the dynamics. There's usually a bit of natural dynamics to a voice or a guitar or any real instrument. And what we're doing is just like controlling the dynamics with a glue compressor. You can use a compressor of your choice, but this is like a pretty simple go-to. And I also have Soothe, which is quite nice for like taming super harsh frequencies, like a little bit of scratching. So without it, you hear a little bit more of like that picking noise when I'm playing, which, you know, might be desirable, but I wanted to just have it like a little bit more tame. Another thing that I sometimes do to highlight elements, and I haven't done too much of it here, but you can use just a little bit of saturation. There's a really good native Ableton saturation tool, but I've got this. But I use this little radiator sometimes from Sound Toys. And all we're doing is like adding a little bit of harmonic distortion, and that usually just adds like warm crunch and moves something a bit further to the front. It's really subtle, but I think that it helped push that element like a little tiny bit more to the front. I also have a compressor on this effects bus. And it's not doing anything too crazy, but all it's doing is just taming when there's lots of transitions and atmospheric things happening in the same group, that they're meant to be not upfront at all, so you can push them back. One way, of course, is like pulling down the high frequencies, and I've done that on some of the individual channels. But I think the key is not to overcomplicate things, and that goes for everything from the melody and the arrangement and the file structure, but especially the mix. I haven't opened this file in ages, to be honest, before I decided to share this today. And going in, I was able to find my way around really easily, and I think it shows that I really prefer the mix on this compared to a lot of other tracks that I've worked on that have much more fancy plugins and compression and effects chains and tons of saturation and automation. But I think it just goes to show, put the time in on the levels, like just spend a lot of time working on the volume and getting it right, looking at your reference, looking at a spectrum analyzer. No matter how many times people say it, it's really hard to believe that that can make such a difference, but that's just the foundation of the track. It will make 90% of the difference, so put a lot of work into getting the volume right. It's my first time doing a video like this, so if you want me to elaborate on anything particular, just let me know. If you found this helpful and you want more videos, you can like and subscribe, or the best thing you can do, honestly, is just go check out the track and save it. If you're looking for some free sample packs or different resources as well, I have a couple of things in the description below. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time, and keep making music in the meantime.